It looked like something from a medieval nightmare, a steel helmet, heavy and tight, lined with inward-facing spikes. Once placed on a prisoner's head, it was screwed down slowly, inch by inch, until the spikes pressed against the scalp, temples, and jaw. Not enough to pierce, at least not at first. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't a tool of execution. It was something much worse. This was psychological torture engineered for endurance, designed to madden, not kill, to break a man from the inside out. Every breath inside the helmet echoed like thunder. Every movement, every blink, became a test of sanity. Days could pass in that hellish confinement. And for those who survived, something was always missing. A piece of the mind never returned. But the most chilling part? This device didn't come from the Dark Ages. It was used in the 20th century, in state-run institutions, hidden away behind walls of silence and steel. This is the story of the helmet that turned men into ghosts, and the system that made it legal. In the northeast of North Korea, near the Chinese border, lies a valley blanketed by silence. No birds sing here. No laughter echoes. This is Camp 22, Hinjiang concentration camp, a sprawling 770-square-kilometer complex of barracks, mines, execution grounds, and torture facilities. Officially, it doesn't exist. Maps do not name it. Photographs are rare. But the horrors inside it have bled out through the whispers of those lucky, or cursed, enough to escape. The regime called it a re-education zone. In reality, it was a death camp, a Soviet-style gulag updated with Orwellian control. Generations of families were imprisoned not for what they had done, but for what their ancestors had said, thought, or imagined. Children born inside Camp 22 never knew a world beyond electrified fences or guard towers. And deep within its bowels, in the concrete labyrinth beneath administrative buildings, the most experimental forms of punishment took place. One room stood apart, cold, bare, and acoustically isolated. Its walls were painted black. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, too dim to illuminate the corners. It wasn't the chains on the walls that terrified inmates. It wasn't even the soundproofing. It was the chair, fixed to the center of the floor, metal rings bolted to its legs and arms. Above it, suspended like some infernal chandelier, was the helmet. It resembled a knight's visor, but bulkier. The steel surface was rusted with time and streaked with fluids that no one wanted to identify. Small crank screws lined the rim, each one attached to inward-facing metal spikes. Dull, not sharp. Painful, not lethal. Guards called it the hat of forgetting. Prisoners called it the scream box. Once the helmet was lowered onto the victim's head and screwed shut, no one ever came back the same. Inmate testimonies collected years later described the effects. Your thoughts collapse, one survivor said. You cannot remember your name. You hear things you're not supposed to hear. Your own breath becomes the enemy. But in 1992, no one on the outside world had any clue it existed. North Korea was already one of the world's most secretive regimes. Under Kim Jong-il, surveillance had replaced society. Fear ruled every home. But even among his brutal machinery of repression, Camp 22 was exceptional. Why? Because it wasn't just a prison. It was a lab. North Korean defectors would later testify to the existence of psychological experiments, the kind that left no bruises, only broken minds. Officials were reportedly obsessed with developing methods to control prisoners without drawing international scrutiny. They wanted total obedience, not just from the body, but from the soul. And that's where the helmet came in. It wasn't built in a factory. It was custom-made, allegedly by military engineers. Modeled after medieval torture devices, updated with psychological principles gleaned from foreign research, including, chillingly, US and Soviet intelligence programs. There are even rumors that blueprints were copied from MKUltra archives smuggled through diplomatic intermediaries. But there's no hard proof, just scars. Inmates would vanish for days, then return, blank-eyed, trembling, unable to speak in full sentences. Some tore out their own hair. Some clawed at walls until their fingernails bled. Others simply stopped moving, their minds locked in some unseen box. And yet, they weren't executed. They were watched, studied, measured. One defector, a former guard, described an incident where a prisoner screamed for hours straight inside the helmet. Not from physical pain, but from remembering. Every childhood memory, every buried trauma, dragged to the surface by enforced silence and absolute sensory focus. It was like the mind turned inside out, he said. Still, this story might have been buried forever, if not for what happened in 1999, when a young medical technician named Juwu fled Camp 22 with a stolen photograph. A blurry black and white image. A metal room. A chair. A helmet. It was the first visual proof the outside world had ever seen. And it raised a terrifying question. Where did this device come from? And how many more were made? The origins of the helmet were never officially recorded. Not in any public archive. Not in any military blueprint database. Not in any leaked intelligence files. But torture leaves a trail. And if you follow the rusted links long enough, eventually, the dark metal door begins to creak open. Some historians trace the concept of the spike helmet back to 16th century Spain, during the reign of the Inquisition. There, iron masks and silence chambers were used to break heretics, not by mutilating their bodies, but by dissolving their identities. Others point to the 1930s Gestapo, who refined psychological breakdown into an art form, isolating prisoners in pitch-black cells with unpredictable sensory assaults. But the device that surfaced in North Korea had a far more modern and disturbing signature. Its construction was too precise. The geometry of the spikes, the adjustable tension screws, the weight distribution, all suggested a deep understanding of neurology and behaviorism. This wasn't just a product of sadism. It was engineered. One declassified South Korean intelligence memo from 2004 refers to the device as Type K disorientation module, suggesting it may have had codename status within the North's clandestine penal system. According to the memo, the device was designed for long-duration psychological compression and identity disintegration. In other words, it was a tool for erasing the self. But how did such a machine come into existence in the first place? A chilling theory points to the 1950s and 60s, during the early days of North Korea's alliance with the Soviet Union and China. During this period, Pyongyang's leadership was obsessed with absolute ideological conformity. The idea that a human being could be rewired, not just punished, but rebuilt, became central to the regime's psychology. Kim Il-sung, the founding dictator, believed in the concept of juche, self-reliance taken to a quasi-religious extreme. Any deviation from this philosophy was not just betrayal, it was infection, and infections had to be purged completely. This ideological extremism opened the door for mind-cleansing techniques. Soviet advisors brought with them decades of psychiatric experimentation, including discredited theories from Pavlov and Bekhterev that focused on breaking down the human will through repetition, noise, and isolation. Chinese operatives, too, offered insights from their own Cultural Revolution-era re-education practices, where public humiliation and forced confessions became daily rituals. But North Korea took it further. Instead of breaking prisoners publicly, they broke them privately, where no one could see, where no one could stop it, and where the mind could be made to collapse inward like a dying star. From this cauldron of ideology, fear, and foreign science, the helmet was born. It wasn't intended for mass use. Only a few were ever made, each allegedly handcrafted by a specialist team within North Korea's Unit 398, a black-budget military department tasked with advanced interrogation and compliance engineering. A former construction engineer who defected in 2007 told UN investigators that he once delivered specialized aluminum and steel to a classified bunker near Hamhong. The specifications? Small, dense domes with adjustable pressure points. The materials were consistent with heat-resistant alloys used in both aerospace and medical instruments. When asked if he ever saw the finished product, the man simply said, "They kept it in a black box." Always a black box. Meanwhile, psychological blueprints for the helmet were reportedly informed by Western documents, particularly those associated with the CIA's MKUltra program, which experimented with sensory deprivation, forced isolation, and psychotropic drugs in the 1950s and 60s. Some of those records, thought to be destroyed, had quietly circulated through diplomatic espionage networks. North Korean intelligence was allegedly desperate to understand what made Western brains break. They didn't want to copy the technology. They wanted to perfect it. And they did. The helmet didn't rely on shock or mutilation. It relied on silence. But not silence as absence, silence as weapon. Once the helmet was locked onto the prisoner's head, the world disappeared. The interior was padded in such a way that external sounds became muffled beyond recognition, while internal sounds, heartbeat, breath, teeth grinding, were amplified, echoed, distorted. A prisoner would begin to lose all sense of time. Minutes felt like hours. Hours bled into days. The longer one wore the helmet, the more the mind began to hallucinate, conjuring memories, fears, voices, all in the pitch black of one's own skull. Prisoners were sometimes left alone in isolation rooms while wearing the helmet for up to 48 hours. They were not allowed to sleep, speak, or remove it. Some defecated in place. Some began to talk to invisible figures. One reportedly bashed his own head against the wall until the spikes finally broke the skin, because that pain was preferable to the one inside. The goal was not to kill. It was to erase, to extract the essence of rebellion from the soul, to make the prisoner grateful just to be allowed to suffer without the helmet. And in that twisted reversal, gratitude for lesser pain, the system found its victory. One man, a former intelligence officer now living in Seoul, summed it up this way: execution ends resistance. But fear, real fear, that makes the mind surrender. The helmet was the altar, the prisoner, the sacrifice, and the gods who watched from behind the glass wanted results. The human mind is astonishingly resilient, capable of withstanding trauma, adapting to chaos, and forging meaning from suffering. But it also has a limit, a breaking point, and the helmet was built to find that threshold and press directly against it. To understand the horror of the spike helmet, you have to imagine what it did not do. It didn't lacerate the skin. It didn't gouge out the eyes or burst the eardrums. There were no screams of blood-curdling agony to echo down stone corridors. The torment was internal, surgical, invisible. When placed on the prisoner's head, the helmet enclosed the skull completely, like a sarcophagus of sound and pressure. A crank system around its rim slowly tightened dozens of dull spikes inward toward key nerve centers: the temples, jawline, occipital bone, scalp, and forehead. The spikes didn't pierce, they pressed. Like dull thorns digging in, just enough to cause aching, swelling, burning discomfort. Not enough to draw blood, but enough to never stop. Psychologists call this low-level chronic pain. But inside a sealed metal shell, it became something else, a storm without escape. The helmet's interior was acoustically designed to create a feedback loop. Every heartbeat, every shallow breath, every twitch of a jawbone created vibrations that bounced and amplified within the chamber. After just a few hours, the wearer's perception of sound turned inward. Normal thoughts became disjointed, like whispers underwater. Some reported hearing voices. Others began to hear screaming, their own, echoing in infinite loops. The spikes stimulated pressure points mapped by neurologists to induce confusion, anxiety, and in some cases, hallucinations. The result was akin to an induced psychotic break. There were no clocks, no windows, no human interaction, just the helmet. And the noise. Sleep was nearly impossible. The compression around the skull disrupted normal blood flow. Migraines formed. Eyes twitched uncontrollably. Numbness spread down into the neck and spine. After 12 to 24 hours, most prisoners entered what doctors called dissociative states, where the mind detaches from reality to protect itself. But the most terrifying consequence? Many didn't recover. Not fully. North Korean defector reports describe prisoners who emerged from helmet sessions blank-eyed and mute. Some refused to respond to their names. Others recited childhood songs over and over, as if trying to anchor themselves to any fragment of identity. A guard, who later fled to Mongolia, described one man who smiled constantly after his release. Not out of joy, but because his facial muscles had locked that way from the strain of clenching his jaw during the ordeal. He looked happy, the guard said, but his eyes were gone. What makes this torture method so uniquely sinister is its invisibility. There were no cigarette burns, no bruises to explain, no missing teeth or broken ribs. On paper, the prisoners were fine, medically sound, fit to return to labor, but they were mentally erased. And in that silence, in that void, the regime had complete power. The spike helmet was part of a larger system of coercive control through invisibility. Physical scars could be shown to human rights agencies, but psychological ones? They were shadows. And North Korea mastered the art of hiding its cruelty beneath technicality. Camp 22 maintained records. Files marked with prisoner numbers, not names. Codes were used instead of descriptions. HLS, for indicated helmet isolation, 48-hour duration. HLS, 5 indicated relapse, a second session for prisoners who continued to display signs of defiance or non-cooperation. Those who resisted a second time were never seen again. Some were disappeared into the mines. Others transferred to Unit 82, a rumored experimental block for irreversible mental degeneration. But for most, one session was enough. The mind is fragile when stripped of context, when time, space, and identity vanish. And that's exactly what the helmet took. Your sense of time? Gone. Your sense of self? Dissolved. Your body? Reduced to a heartbeat echoing in a metal shell. It wasn't a device of rage. It was a device of precision cruelty. A quiet, methodical method of destruction, designed not to kill, but to render the prisoner a shell of who they were. To turn dissidents into docile workers, fighters into shadows. One survivor, in a recorded testimony now housed at the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, said the following: "I forgot my sister's name. I forgot my mother's face. When they took the helmet off, I felt like I was still wearing it. For days, maybe weeks, maybe, I still am." That testimony was one of the few the outside world ever heard. Most who endured the helmet never spoke again. And even among defectors, few will even admit it existed. Because for them, the spikes aren't just metal. They're memory. Inside the barbed wire borders of Camp 22, guilt was inherited. It didn't matter if you'd never committed a crime. If your grandfather had spoken against the regime, if your uncle had tried to defect, if your father once listened to a foreign radio broadcast, you were marked. A stain on the bloodline. And in North Korea, the stain must be punished. This policy, known as 3 generations of guilt, condemned entire families to a life sentence. Infants were born into prison blocks. Elderly women died in chains. Children grew up not knowing freedom, only suspicion and surveillance. In this system of generational damnation, the regime didn't need proof. It needed obedience. But the spike helmet wasn't used on just anyone. Its victims were hand-selected, plucked from the sea of inmates for one shared trait: they had not broken. The most dangerous prisoner wasn't the one who shouted back. It was the one who remained quiet, who endured without weeping, who met the guard's eyes with flickers of retained dignity. And so, ironically, it was the strongest, not the weakest, who were subjected to the worst. Psychological torture, by its nature, is a weapon of control, not punishment. And the regime wanted total, irreversible submission. That meant targeting those who still held on to slivers of defiance, memory, or belief. Many were former professors, artists, doctors, people who had known the world before the regime's Iron Curtain fell. One man, referred to in declassified testimonies only as Subject 117, was reportedly a former university lecturer imprisoned for criticizing agricultural policies in a private letter to his cousin. He had not screamed in his first year of imprisonment. He did not cry during beatings. His work output remained high, but his silence, his stillness, unnerved the guards. So they selected him, and they strapped him in. Witnesses reported that after his session with the helmet, Subject 117 returned to the fields within 3 days. But he was different. He did not speak again. He stared at the ground when addressed. He lost his balance while walking. And within a month, he collapsed and died of what was officially recorded as respiratory illness. There was no autopsy. The helmet was reserved for non-compliant prisoners who refused to degrade themselves, those who wouldn't falsely confess, who didn't grovel or inform on others. It was the final attempt to extract total obedience, and if that failed, the system discarded the subject. Women were not spared. Multiple female defectors have spoken, under protection, about the use of the helmet on women who resisted sexual abuse from guards. In a society where shame is weaponized, these women were branded unstable, uncooperative, and emotionally defective. The helmet, in these cases, was used as a form of both punishment and conditioning, breaking the psyche so thoroughly that they would no longer resist the abuses of power. One survivor, known by the alias Moran, described the aftermath of such a session. She, the prisoner, didn't speak anymore. She smiled, but not at anything. She couldn't eat unless you told her when. They called it a cure. This euphemism, cure, reflected the official stance of the regime. The helmet wasn't seen as torture. It was a corrective measure, a recalibration of disobedient minds. And it worked. It worked so well that guards began to fear it. Reports emerged that some lower-ranking officers refused to enter the helmet room. One defected guard claimed that even high-ranking officials avoided direct contact with the device. "It's not just the prisoners who break," he said. "Even we heard the screams. In our heads. When no one was screaming." But the system persisted. Files marked with HLS codes began to accumulate. Subject profiles were updated post-helmet. Behavior notes such as, now cooperative, no longer resistant, unresponsive, suitable for menial labor, appeared in marginalia. Some were deemed successes. Others were labeled irrecoverable and moved to medical units, where they disappeared. And behind every selection, behind every profile, there was a cold, brutal logic. If you cannot be broken through fear, you will be broken through silence. This was the cost of rebellion in Camp 22. Not death, but erasure. And it didn't stop with prisoners. Records suggest that internal political purges within the camp's own administration, guards, clerks, even medical staff, sometimes resulted in helmet treatment as well. Disobedient workers, whistleblowers, those who asked questions. In a place where trust was a liability, the helmet became the final test of loyalty, a twisted rite of passage. And for those who survived it, they carried the silence with them. Even years later, in safety, in exile, they spoke slowly, carefully, as if the spikes were still hovering, ready to descend. Because the true horror wasn't the pain. It was that the regime knew this would work. It was scientific, methodical, approved. The spike helmet was not the invention of madmen. It was the invention of bureaucrats. Most torture leaves scars, fractured bones, burnt flesh, missing fingernails. These are wounds the world can see, photograph, and document. But what happens when the damage hides in the folds of the brain? When the pain cannot be proven, only endured? That's the genius of psychological torture. And the spike helmet was one of its most insidious masterpieces. Modern neuroscience has revealed that prolonged sensory distortion, like that caused by isolation, silence, and internalized noise, can shatter the brain's ability to distinguish real from imagined. The mind begins to turn on itself. Thoughts loop. Hallucinations bleed into memory. Identity, the very sense of I, begins to dissolve. The spike helmet weaponized this exact mechanism. It created a closed circuit of mental torment, trapping the prisoner's consciousness in a metal shell. No voices, no light, no external stimulus. Just the dull ache of spikes pressing into nerve centers and the echo chamber of one's own mind, spiraling out of control. Western psychologists refer to this as perceptual annihilation. A 2009 study by neuroscientist Ian Robbins, examining former detainees who suffered solitary confinement and sensory deprivation, found that symptoms of PTSD were not only more intense, they were different. Survivors reported long-term memory fragmentation, phantom voices, and emotional deadening. These were not injuries. These were amputations of the soul. The spike helmet's design mapped precisely to regions of the skull associated with memory, language, and emotional regulation. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. The spikes weren't sharpened for pain. They were placed for disruption. North Korean medical defectors revealed that post-helmet prisoners often displayed what's known as psychogenic mutism, an inability to speak due to psychological shock. Others developed facial tics, aphasia, or a symptom dubbed mirror blindness, where individuals failed to recognize their own reflections. One prisoner, after being shown a mirror for the first time post-helmet, reportedly said, "That man's eyes are too quiet. He is not me." But perhaps the most disturbing consequence was something far less visible: obedience. After the helmet, prisoners complied. They lined up. They followed orders without hesitation. They stopped questioning, not because they were afraid, but because the part of them that questioned was gone. They had been hollowed out. And this, more than anything, reveals the regime's ultimate intention. They didn't want corpses. They wanted puppets. By destroying the internal compass, the conscience, the memory, the identity, they created beings who existed solely to follow, produce, and obey. machines and human skin. The helmet wasn't just torture. It was behavioral engineering. What's even more terrifying is that this wasn't a uniquely North Korean tactic. Across the world, governments have experimented with non-lethal psychological pressure techniques under the guise of interrogation, compliance, or behavioral modification. In 1971, the Stanford prison experiment revealed that ordinary people, when given unchecked authority, would quickly escalate to emotional abuse. In Guantanamo Bay, detainees were subjected to prolonged white noise, forced positions, and hooding for days, all forms of sensory and identity disruption. But the Spike helmet took these ideas to their most literal and most grotesque form. And the fact that no international body has ever publicly confirmed its use speaks volumes about how psychological torture slips through the cracks of accountability. Pain that doesn't bleed is easy to ignore, even easier to deny. Camp 22 was closed in 2012, at least officially. Satellite images show many of its buildings dismantled, its gates sealed. But the system that created the helmet, the philosophy of breaking minds to protect the state, still survives. Defectors claim that the device may have been moved to Camp 16 or hidden deep within military intelligence sites. There are rumors of updated versions, lighter, more advanced, equipped with auditory devices to manipulate internal sound. But nothing has been confirmed. Why? Because those subjected to the helmet either vanish or forget. And forgetting is the ultimate victory of such a tool, because it erases not just the witness, but the witnessing. One North Korean human rights advocate, herself a camp-born survivor, said it best. If they hit you, you can scream. If they stab you, you can cry. But when they make you forget how to scream or why to cry, they've already won. And that is what the helmet did. It didn't hurt the body. It removed the need to be a person. In a regime built on silence, truth is a death sentence. But truth has a strange way of surviving. In smuggled whispers, in stolen documents, in the trembling testimonies of those who can no longer bear the weight of secrets. And for a device as monstrous as the Spike helmet, the truth could not stay buried forever. Some of the earliest confirmed accounts came not from prisoners, but from guards. Disillusioned, traumatized, or simply terrified of their own fate, a small number of former officials defected between 1997 and 2011. Among them was Kang Kol-hwan, a former inmate of Yoda concentration camp, who went on to become one of the most outspoken defectors and co-authors of the Aquariums of Pyongyang. While he never directly encountered the helmet, he documented eerily similar tactics of prolonged sensory torture and psychological dismemberment. But it was the defection of Lieutenant Jun-hyuk in 2005 that shattered the wall of denial. Jun-hyuk served in the Internal Security Division assigned to Camp 22's Psychological Control Wing. His testimony, delivered under anonymity in a debriefing with South Korean intelligence, detailed the helmet's use on Category 3 prisoners, individuals labeled as ideologically resistant. He described rooms sealed from sound, light-proof enclosures, and mental recalibration protocols involving devices placed on the head. Most chilling was his memory of the screams. You never heard them with your ears, but you felt them, in your chest, in your dreams. There was a sound like metal crying. Though corroborating physical evidence remained elusive, his account aligned with dozens of indirect reports from former inmates. A woman known only as C&Me, a former nurse assigned to the camp's neuro ward, recalled treating prisoners with no visible injuries but profound neurological damage. One patient sat motionless for 3 days, blinking in rhythm with a pulse monitor. Another kept asking when the music would stop, even though the room was silent. She described a device she once saw delivered to the ward, wrapped in black canvas, with tightening screws and internal padding. It reeked of oil and sweat. When she asked what it was, the officer said, "It helps them forget." That phrase echoed across multiple testimonies. Helps them forget. Always spoken with bureaucratic coldness, as if wiping away a person's identity was just another line item in a prison manual. A former maintenance worker smuggled out a crude sketch of the helmet. The drawing was childlike, shaky lines, uneven proportions, but unmistakable, a dome with internal spikes and side-mounted knobs. The sketch was quietly circulated among NGOs, included in a 2013 Human Rights Watch report. but never officially acknowledged by any government. Too disturbing. Too unverifiable. Too possible. In 2017, a South Korean film crew attempted to recreate the helmet's design based on survivor descriptions. They presented the replica to a panel of defectors. Two immediately left the room. One woman collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. A man, thin and hollow-eyed, simply muttered, "It's too small." The real one covered your soul. But perhaps the most powerful evidence wasn't visual. It was behavioral. Psychiatrists working with defectors noticed a pattern. Certain survivors, especially those from Camp 22, displayed symptoms inconsistent with known torture methods. These included complete memory loss of specific time frames, fear of enclosed spaces despite no reported confinement, auditory hallucinations involving mechanical sounds, inability to process reflective surfaces, such as mirrors or windows. These were not side effects of beatings. These were the echoes of psychological decimation. One survivor, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, said she remembered being in a chair, and then, nothing. Weeks vanished from her life. She woke up unable to recall her name. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking for 5 years. When asked what she thought happened to her, she whispered, "They took my voice away." The therapist asked, "And how did they do that?" She paused, then pointed at her forehead. "They drilled into here. But not with tools. With silence." These fragments, scattered across years and testimonies, paint a dark mosaic. The Spike helmet was never officially recorded, never confirmed in a press release or condemned in a treaty. But it lives in the haunted eyes of those who speak of it, and the silence of those who never will. And as more witnesses come forward, a new question emerges. If such a device existed, who else knew about it? The Spike helmet feels like a relic of dystopian fiction, a grotesque one-off from the mind of a despot. But the uncomfortable truth is this: it wasn't created in a vacuum. Its blueprints may have originated far closer to home than we'd like to admit. Because while North Korea perfected psychological torture, the West pioneered it. In the early 1950s, as Cold War tensions escalated into an arms race of ideology, the United States launched a secret program called MKUltra. The CIA, desperate to develop methods of interrogation, mind control, and truth extraction, funded dozens of experiments, many illegal, some criminal, that tested the very boundaries of human endurance. Patients at psychiatric hospitals were subjected to forced LSD trips, prolonged sensory deprivation, and electroshock therapy, so intense it erased basic memory functions. Some were kept in white rooms for days with goggles, headphones, and gloves, all to eliminate sensory input. They were left alone, drifting in a cocoon of silence. One internal CIA memo from 1954 reads, "The aim is to reduce the subject to a state of helpless compliance, to the point where identity and belief systems can be overwritten." Sound familiar? Donald Ewan Cameron, a Canadian psychiatrist funded by the CIA, conducted psychic driving experiments on unwitting patients. Using a combination of sleep deprivation, immobilization, and repeated audio loops, he attempted to reprogram minds. Many of his subjects never recovered. Some regressed to infantile states. One woman forgot her husband, children, and entire adult life. This wasn't fiction. This was taxpayer-funded science. And while MKUltra was officially shut down in the 1970s, its ideas and its failures seeded darker practices elsewhere. The American prison system, especially during the War on Terror, began to adopt enhanced interrogation techniques in black sites from Guantanamo Bay to Abu Ghraib. Hooding, forced isolation, white noise bombardment, temperature manipulation. These weren't medieval tactics. They were clinical, calibrated. The CIA's own training manuals from the 1980s detail the psychological impact of stress positions and sensory control. One passage eerily mirrors the philosophy behind the helmet. Pain that leaves no mark is the most efficient tool for compliance. The subject should not remember what was done, only that they are no longer themselves. In short, break the identity, not the body. This is where the Spike helmet fits in. It wasn't just an invention of cruelty. It was the logical endpoint of decades of global research into non-lethal coercion. If a regime wanted to control, not kill, if it wanted obedience without outrage, this was the way. And North Korea, ever secretive, ever watchful, had access to this knowledge. Former intelligence analysts believe that black market espionage networks passed fragments of MKUltra data to foreign regimes. Through diplomatic backchannels, embassies, and defectors, psychological warfare tactics became exportable technology. A silent Cold War of ideas and control. Even more disturbingly, leaked Chinese intelligence reports from the early 2000s reference cognitive restriction modules used in certain high-risk prisoner camps. One diagram bears uncanny resemblance to the helmet design described by North Korean witnesses. The image showed a domed apparatus with internal stimulus regulators and adjustable pressure points. It's not just North Korea. It's not just the past. It's now. The idea that governments, any government, would willingly erase a human being's mind without drawing blood should terrify us. Because it means the rules of accountability don't apply when the damage is invisible. If there are no bruises, there is no crime. If the victim forgets, there is no witness. If the records are buried, there is no history. Human rights groups have pushed for a global ban on psychological torture techniques, but enforcement is nearly impossible. Devices like the helmet don't need electric current. They don't leave marks. They don't scream. They whisper. And they work. So if we recoil at the idea of a helmet lined with spikes, we must also ask, what quiet cruelties have we allowed in our own name? Because the echoes of this device are not confined to one gulag. They are embedded in the philosophy of control wherever it lives. And the next time one is used, it might not be in the shadows. It might be in broad daylight. Cruelty, when it becomes systematic, isn't the work of monsters. It's the work of planners, of administrators, of men in suits with calm voices and tidy desks. The most efficient horror is always bureaucratic. That's what makes the spike helmet so terrifying. Not that it was used, but that it was designed, tested, approved, and logged. Psychologists and philosophers have long tried to understand how ordinary people commit extraordinary evil. From the death camps of Nazi Germany to the prison abuses of Abu Ghraib, the question is always the same. How does cruelty become policy? The answer lies in distance. Not physical distance, but emotional and moral detachment. The more abstract the victim, the easier it becomes to harm them. Prisoner isn't a father or a poet or a son. He's a number on a form. A target in a psychological study. A non-compliant asset. In Camp 22, guards were trained not to see prisoners as human. They were taught that resistance was disease, and disease must be treated, not with medicine, but with correction. And so the helmet wasn't a weapon. It was a tool, a solution. One defector guard said he never considered himself cruel. I never hit anyone, he told investigators. I didn't enjoy their suffering. I was just following protocol. The helmet was assigned by the commander. We only monitored vitals. No one died on my watch. No one died. But minds shattered. Identities vanished. Souls crumbled. This is the heart of institutional cruelty. No one person feels responsible. The designer only built it. The commander only approved it. The guard only applied it. The medic only recorded the outcome. No one tortured anyone. And yet, torture happened. Stanley Milgram's infamous obedience experiments in the 1960s demonstrated this principle with chilling clarity. Ordinary participants, instructed by an authority figure, willingly administered what they believed were fatal electric shocks to strangers, simply because they were told to. The conclusion? Most people will harm others if someone in power tells them it's acceptable. And when that harm becomes part of a system, with rules, paperwork, and chain of command, it stops feeling like harm. It starts feeling like procedure. The spike helmet is the physical manifestation of this mindset. It wasn't made by sadists in a dungeon. It was commissioned by officials, designed by engineers, endorsed by doctors, applied by guards, cataloged by administrators. Each step removed from the next. Each role sanitized by language. Pain became data. Suffering became silence. And cruelty became invisible. But there's another layer, one even darker. Because this kind of cruelty doesn't just destroy the victim. It infects the perpetrator. Several former guards who defected described nightmares. Not of the screams, but of the stillness. Of watching people sit motionless, unblinking, with the helmet locked around their heads. One said he sometimes heard metallic clicking when no one else did. Another developed tinnitus, a constant ringing in his ears, after working in the helmet wing for 6 months. A medic assigned to monitor sessions claimed she began hearing breathing sounds that weren't hers. In empty rooms, even among those who enforced the helmet, there was no escape from its psychological reach. Because deep down, they knew what they were doing. And the guilt metastasized. When asked why no one stopped it, a former intelligence officer answered with brutal simplicity, because it worked. It's the same answer given at every checkpoint of historical evil. Why the gas chambers? Why the re-education camps? Why the black sites? Because it worked. Obedience was restored. Resistance collapsed. Information was extracted. Order was maintained. But at what cost? The helmet didn't just torture individuals. It broadcast a message. Your mind is not your own. Your thoughts are conditional. Your silence is survival. It turned every prisoner into a lesson for the others. And that's how fear becomes culture. That's how cruelty becomes normal. In a world where surveillance grows, where AI monitors behavior, where dissidence is increasingly subtle, we must ask, what new helmets are we building? What systems of invisible control are we normalizing? Because history doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it tightens. Camp 22 officially ceased operations in 2012, or so the regime claimed. Satellite images showed a drawdown. Fewer vehicles. Empty barracks. Demolished structures. Western media reported the closure as a rare, if confusing, act of reform. But for those who understood the system, the silence wasn't cause for celebration. It was cause for dread. Because North Korea never shuts down its methods. It relocates them. And in the years following Camp 22's closure, disturbing whispers began to emerge, not just from within North Korea, but from the outside world. In 2014, a defector known by the alias Yong described being transferred from Camp 22 to a facility deep in the mountains near Gyeonggi, in Jagong Province, an area known for housing secret weapons facilities. There, he claimed, he saw a familiar device. But this time, it was smaller, lighter, and wired. The new model, according to Yong, incorporated auditory devices embedded inside the helmet's inner walls. Instead of relying solely on silence and spikes, this version reportedly used low-frequency hums, pulsing at irregular intervals. These frequencies, known in neuroscience as binaural beats, have been studied for their potential to influence brainwave activity. When played into each ear at slightly different pitches, they can induce altered states of consciousness, confusion, even dissociation. Young claimed prisoners subjected to the new helmet began to stutter. Others sobbed uncontrollably. Some began repeating their own names over and over, until they forgot why they had started. And this version wasn't used in isolation chambers anymore. It was used in training centers. Another defector, a former North Korean military officer, told Japanese journalists in 2016 that certain interrogation centers in Pyongyang had acquired what he called cognitive reset helmets. These were used not on prisoners, but on loyal operatives who had witnessed classified events. The helmet had become a tool of erasure. Not punishment, not reformation, control. If someone saw what they shouldn't have, remembered what they weren't allowed to, the helmet became the final filter. An untraceable lobotomy. This tracks with global trends in psychological warfare. Intelligence agencies have long studied methods of memory manipulation, from amnesia-inducing drugs to hypnosis. But no method is simpler than overstimulation and isolation. And if you could refine that into a device, the possibilities were limitless, even profitable. In 2019, a leaked procurement document surfaced from an unnamed Middle Eastern nation. Among the listed items, sensory management domes, Model K2. The product, manufactured by a company with connections to Chinese psychological research labs, included specifications eerily similar to Yang's description. Dome-shaped headgear, audio modulation, neurological pressure points. The document was quietly buried. No further leaks followed. But researchers in the international human rights community took note. Some believe a global black market may exist, not for weapons of mass destruction, but for tools of invisible compliance. And the helmet, whether in its North Korean incarnation or its modern iterations, sits at the center. A perfect storm of psychological disruption, neurological targeting, data-less torture. It doesn't need electricity. It doesn't need drugs. It doesn't need scars. It only needs time and silence. What makes this resurfacing even more disturbing is its flexibility. The original helmet was physical, brutal, unmistakable, but its principles, isolation, internal sensory amplification, cognitive fracture, can now be replicated with technology. Immersive VR environments that simulate sensory deprivation, directed sound pulses through bone conduction, AI-driven emotional conditioning in detention facilities. These aren't conspiracy theories. They're products being developed, tested, and quietly deployed in real-world environments. Some under military programs, others in behavioral research centers. And while no one dares call them torture devices, their purpose is clear: change the brain, bypass the will, leave no evidence. So no, the helmet never disappeared. It evolved. It went underground, into new camps, new labs, new hands. And as surveillance becomes smarter and repression becomes subtler, the spike helmet may become the symbol of a new era, not one of open brutality, but of quiet compliance. An era where the worst crimes leave no trace, just shadows where people used to be. There is a point beyond pain, a place where the human mind stops resisting, not out of defeat, but because it no longer remembers what resistance feels like. It forgets how to imagine freedom. It forgets how to hope. That's what the spike helmet was built to reach. And in that place, the regime doesn't just own your body. It owns your being. In North Korea, the helmet was not a rogue tool. It was an instrument of doctrine, born from a system that believed dissent could be extracted like a tumor, that identity could be reshaped like wet clay. The mind wasn't sacred. It was state property. And once broken, the individual ceased to exist. In Camp 22, prisoners who emerged from helmet sessions were not the same. They moved like sleepwalkers. They obeyed instantly. They forgot names, even their own. They worked until collapse, not because they feared punishment, but because the concept of defiance had been surgically removed. That is the ultimate horror. Not death, but unpersoning. In a regime of constant terror, compliance is currency. The spike helmet refined that currency by erasing what could not be beaten or starved away: conviction. It turned strength into stillness. And it taught everyone watching the same brutal lesson: you don't have to be tortured. You just have to remember the people who were. That's how the system stays intact. Not through bullets, not through chains, but through invisible obedience. This psychological suppression isn't limited to North Korea. Across history, totalitarian regimes have used silence, isolation, and fear to dominate minds. The KGB, the Stasi, the Khmer Rouge, each developed unique tools to dismantle identity without drawing global scrutiny. But none matched the precision of the spike helmet, because it reduced resistance to a switch. Turn it off. No blood, no corpse, just compliance. And when the mind breaks, when memory fragments, when thought loops collapse, when the inner voice goes quiet, the system wins in full. The broken cannot protest. The silenced cannot testify. The erased cannot revolt. They are no longer enemies of the state. They are ghosts inside their own skin. So where does that leave us? With a choice: to look away and let the silence grow, or to remember, to bear witness, to say the names of the forgotten. Because even if the helmet destroyed their voices, ours still remain, and they must be used, not just to tell their story, but to make sure no system anywhere ever perfects silence again. You've just witnessed one of the darkest, most disturbing instruments of control in modern history, a helmet not designed to kill, but to erase. The spike helmet reminds us that the worst torture doesn't always come with scars or screams. Sometimes it comes in silence, in forgotten rooms, in erased names, and sometimes the world never hears about it until it's too late. If this story shook you, disturbed you, or opened your eyes to hidden horrors, subscribe to the channel. These stories need to be told and remembered, because silence, as we've seen, can be weaponized. Leave a comment. What would you do if you woke up and realized your own thoughts weren't yours anymore? And if you're ready for another story even darker than this, one involving a room that supposedly drove every person insane within 24 hours, check out our next documentary right here. Some stories are unbelievable. Others are unforgivable. But this one was almost unbelievable and forgotten. Until now.